Hi, this is Carsten Werner reporting live here from the International Schiller-Institute conference in Flörsheim, Germany. With me now I have Mike Billington, who is the head of the Asia desk of Executive Intelligence Review. Hi, Mike.
Hi, very glad to be here. Delighted to be at this conference in Germany.
I want to ask him a few questions about his speech, and let's just start simply. US-Asia relationships, what's going on there?
Well, as you know, they've had the so-called pivot to Asia that Obama announced, supposedly because the world economy is shifting to the Pacific, which of course is true. But the obvious intent here, when looked at globally, is that as the US and the British are doing in Europe, setting up ABM systems around Russia's border, provoking wars in the Middle East that directly threaten Russia and China. But in the Asia theater, the idea was that to contain a rise of China, to prevent them from in some way intruding into the global financial empire of the British and their American puppets, they've moved to militarily encircle China. So this includes sending new troops, new basing rights in the Philippines, in Vietnam, and Singapore, expanding their ABM systems and their radar systems, which the Chinese recognize very clearly, as the Russians do, that this is not just to guard against North Korea or Iran, but is aimed at undermining China's strategic defense against the nuclear attack, which in the current global financial breakdown crisis and the insanity of the push for global war coming out of London and out of Obama, the Chinese recognize as a very real danger.
Now, some people will say that this kind of policy looks and sounds like the Cold War policy, but what you make clear in your speech is that this goes way back, and it's not the idea of an American empire, as a lot of people like to have it, but it's actually a British empire. Can you say more about that?
Well, I would say it's not even a British empire. We use the term British Empire, but it's a global financial empire, which happens to be centered in London and certainly is also centered in Wall Street. But the point is that we're looking at the final breakdown of this global bubble, which has been created really for the last 35 years, at least since 1971, when they decoupled the dollar from gold and began the speculation in currencies. This is built up, as LaRouche has warned since before the breakdown in 1971, would necessarily lead to both global depression and to war. War driven by desperate financial oligarchs who are losing their financial empire. So yes, this is exactly what it is. It's a situation like other times in history when interests like that of Leibniz and the Jesuits in the 17th and 18th century who were going to China, trying to build ties between Europe and Asia, and Leibniz, who was working with both Russia and China to build a bridge for all of Eurasia to counter the British and the imperial interests that tried to keep the world divided and therefore controlled. It was the empire that undermined the effort at that time, which is one of the things I address in my presentation. But it's that we're up against today. The empire is willing and able to launch global thermonuclear war. They would prefer that Russia and China and all nations just give up and succumb to a new global empire without sovereignty. But if they don't simply lay over dead, then they're willing to start a war, and it would be thermonuclear in order to preserve their power.
Which leads to the next question, which is, what is the alternative? Because a lot of people say China is our biggest economic rival from the US position, but what's there on common ground? What has Leibniz got to do with this?
Well, clearly we have to end the war. There's no question about that. We have to prevent, not end, stop the outbreak of this war. But I think the importance of what Lynn and Helga LaRouche have fought for the last 40 years, more, and which Leibniz fought for, was that the only way you prevent war, the only way you can actually assure peace, is by establishing collaboration around great economic development. Is that if you create a common interest on both sides of a conflict of some sort, the common interest of mutually developing the productive power of their labor power on both sides. Then you create a common interest in which both sides recognize that the common aims of mankind can only be found through a political, peaceful settlement to whatever claims have been there, real or imagined. There are real claims between powers and real differences that have to be worked out. But the way the British play this is by getting people to think from the bottom up, as Jacques Cheminade says in his presentation today, rather than thinking from the top down about how dangerous we are right now in the world and about what the common aims of mankind in fact really are. And if we think of that way, if we look at it that way, if we think in the future instead of just linearly from the situation as it exists today, but think about what can be and what must be, then we can work these problems out.
Right, and I think what has to be absolutely in the center is the question that we are eventually all one human species. And you brought up a really beautiful example of Leibniz saying something about the Chinese, right?
Yes, Leibniz studied the Chinese philosophy. He read Confucius and Mencius. And while the Venetian Empire, which was the empire of its day, fought to stop the collaboration with China by denouncing Confucianism as being totally unacceptable to a Christian, and that a person who is a Christian must denounce the Confucian thinking. Leibniz, to the contrary, who studied Confucianism, said that Confucianism is pure Christianity in the sense that it identifies the truth which is inscribed in our hearts, a truly universal concept.
And I think that's what has been developed in your speech and a lot of other speeches here. I mean, we have dozens of nations represented here, and so people should watch the whole proceedings of this conference and join the fight. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.